I'm making a video game. When last we left it, it looked like this. Riveting stuff, isn't it? Job done, releasing on Steam tomorrow, go wishlist it now. No, but seriously, this is the groundwork for my arcade twin-stick shooter with roguelite elements, currently referred to as Project NBT, or Next Big Thing. And that twin-stick shooter part is kind of important, so let's talk game design. But first, obviously, as I move through development, I can't have a green square running around forever. Or, I could if I wasn't also making devlog videos that I'd like you to watch and then like and then subscribe and then show to all your friends. But since you're here, clearly I am, and I doubt you want to look at a Windows 95 screensaver for the next 2 years. So let's get some graphics. Now, you might not know this about me, but I am not in any way artistically skilled. At all. I would struggle to draw a straight line with a ruler. But that's fine because we're still in the prototyping phase of figuring things out, so all we actually need is some placeholder art. Teachable moment for you. Placeholder art does not matter. You can, if you want, head to your asset store of choice and purchase some pre-prepared art assets made by people far more talented than you. Or because this stuff is never going to see the light of day in a final real release, you can just steal something that you like. It's a legal grey area, but in the end, as long as you're not trying to sell it, there's very little that anyone can do to you. So don't worry about it. Having said that, please don't refer to this video in your legal defence when you're being sued for everything you own. I take no responsibility for your actions, please leave me out of it. And so in the spirit of that, I thought I'd borrow some assets from a company that's clearly very positive about fan games and third-party usage of their intellectual property. Nintendo. Here's what the game looks like now. This, in case you somehow didn't know, is a Wizrobe enemy from the original Legend of Zelda. The layout, in case you somehow didn't know, is the dungeon tile set from the original Legend of Zelda. This cursor, in case you somehow didn't know, is the compass item from the original Legend. You know what, you get the point. I can see absolutely no negative consequences to this whatsoever. I'm sure Nintendo will be more than happy with my temporary use of their iconic asset in this fashion. And I definitely won't get sued, go bankrupt, and be forced to pay penance by running their social media channels 5 minutes after the next direct presentation. It's fine. Anyway, it's only so that you and I are no longer looking at a green square. The green square's still there, you just can't see it anymore. It also gives us something to scale and design around so that we can start blocking in basic movement, the rough amount of space the player has to move in, enemy behaviours, and all that other interesting stuff that actually forms game design. Because all of that is incredibly important because this is a twin-stick shooter. And if it's going to be a good one, it's going to need a few things, which I'm going to ramble about for a good 10 minutes or so. But first, we need to sort out. Grab your workbooks, kids, because it's time for a history lesson. Way back in 1980, a gentleman named Alan McNeil had a dream. Literally a dream, as in he was asleep and something played in his head. That dream involved a black and white video game in which the player had to run around fighting some robots. Alan McNeil would, following that dream, go on to make a game called Berserk, a top-down maze game where the player ran around fighting some robots. Incidentally, Berserk was, I think, the first recorded case of a death being attributed to a game, because someone famously had a heart attack while they were playing it. Brutal. Anyway, Berserk is not a twin-stick shooter because it only has one stick. But it did go on to inspire arcade legend Eugene Jarvis to create this. This is Robotron 2084, the first twin-stick shooter ever made. Twin stick comes from this. Twin sticks. Most arcade machines had, one. Robotron, though, had two, which, teachable moment, is more than one. Like and subscribe for this incredibly educational content. The left stick was responsible for movement and the right handled shooting and aiming. What this meant was you could now move and shoot in independent directions, which would become an incredibly important part of the gameplay loop of the entire genre. These days, the most popular twin-stick shooters are also available on PC, where the stick-based control scheme is replaced with a keyboard and mouse setup, with the keys handling movement and the mouse usually handling aiming and shooting. The classic control format fits perfectly on modern controllers which have, of course, two sticks. But what's great about the genre is that despite being invented in 1982, the core values of a good twin-stick shooter haven't changed a lot in 40 years, and we're going to talk about them. They're actually very simple, and you can boil down a good twin-stick shooter to just two main design considerations, the first of which is Obviously, when you've got a stick dedicated to doing nothing but moving, it must be pretty important to move. And as the genre has developed, still the most important aspect of what makes a good one is how that movement is implemented. All the way back in Robotron, everything is geared towards how you master your movement options. Because it was on an 8-way gated arcade stick, you could move in 8 directions. And Robotron plays with this in a few clever ways. There are these enemies, for example, known as Hulks. They move at random, but most importantly, they only move in 4 directions. What this means is the player always has a movement advantage over them, which is good, because they're also invincible. So what you've got is a slow-moving, less mobile, permanent threat that you need to use your movement abilities to navigate and deal with, because you can't shoot them. Every single one of the half a dozen enemies in Robotron are designed to test your ability to move. If there was no shooting involved at all, Robotron 2084 would still be a well-designed video game, because the short and simple options you're given are tested with such a variety, in just the 5 or 6 enemies that Robotron had available at the time, that you could play for years and still receive a fresh challenge every time you boot it up. In fact, let's prove it. This is Every Extend Extra. It is not a twin-stick shooter because it's on the PSP and that only had 1 stick. Instead, it's a sort of active puzzle game where the challenge comes from getting into just the right position to create the most advantageous explosion. This is a game uniquely constructed around just movement. It's a twin-stick shooter with only 1 stick, basically, and it's the perfect example of how deceptively good the movement has to be in order for this genre to work. If you don't get the movement right, nothing else will ever be good ever again in your game ever again at all, ever. So it's quite important. You might have seen from the footage earlier that the current prototype has a nice spacious arena, and the player moves pretty quickly. If you watched my previous devlog series, you'll know that I spent hours playing with the main character's movement variables, because of how important it was to set that basis for the rest of forever. It's the same thing here. I have spent hours, and I'm still spending hours, playing with the movement. I have to, because as I think I've just outlined to you, it's probably the most important part of the entire genre. There's also the... Built into the current prototype is a dash mechanic. This is also getting played with a lot because in the history of the genre it's actually a relatively new invention. Probably the most famous recent implementation is in Enter the Gungeon, where a well-timed roll can keep you from death because as you do so, you enter a temporary moment of invincibility. Now this does not last for the entire roll. Not to get super technical, but as in games such as Elden Ring, this roll comes with a certain number of what we call iframes. That is, frames of animation where you are I, with the I standing for invincible, obviously. This is something I decided I had to have because anything that I can do to increase the strategy involved in movement will add complexity and a higher skill ceiling to the game, while also giving the player more tools and advantages over the enemies they'll be facing. When we come to talk about designing difficulty for a top-down shooter, we'll cover player bias and how to incorporate that into your design. But for now, all you need to know is that a dodge, a dash, a roll, or something that just suddenly and abruptly moves the player out of the way is a pretty good tool to have in the box. We'll also talk about how you use enemies together, as well as maybe some optional stage mechanics and hazards, to dynamically test and challenge the player's movement abilities, because that's where the bulk of your challenge is going to come from. The rest of it comes from how you implement the second of the 2 main design considerations for a twin-stick shooter, namely... I bet you thought I was going to say shooting, didn't you? Shooting is part of this category, but it's not all of it. Instead, it's best summarised as options. I don't mean a menu that lets you set graphical quality or whatever, I mean what options you give the player from one moment to the next. A twin-stick shooter is at its core a game about decision making. It's a fast-paced series of meaningful choices like trying to speedrun an end-of-year exam. Let me explain. This is Smash TV. If you watched the first episode, and you really should have done, you'll know we're going to be talking about Smash TV a lot, because it's the basis for what I consider the seminal example of the genre. Incidentally, this was also designed by Eugene Jarvis, who I mentioned earlier as the inventor of the whole thing with Robotron 2084. So that makes sense. In Smash TV there are these things, pickups. They exist for offensive upgrades like better weaponry, and also defensive upgrades like faster movement speed, which plays with the movement mechanics, which is further proof that I was right about 2 minutes ago when I wouldn't shut up about moving around the screen, how dare you doubt me, and invincibility. There are also hundreds upon thousands of things for you to collect that increase your score. Kids, this might not make sense to you right now, but a long time ago, the best you could hope for at the end of a game, especially an arcade game, was a really, really big number that you could brag about. It's not so much of a thing anymore, but back in the day, that number and your initials sat next to them was everything. It was what you aimed for. and it was what drove you to become better and more competent. All so that at the end, once you'd plunged all of your money into this big wooden glowing box, you could write the word ass at the top of a list and show it off to everybody. Simpler times. Anyway, it's important you realise the old school focus on score chasing because it's part of what influences your options, which is what I'm trying to teach you, so pay attention. At any given moment in a good twin stick shooter, you will have more than one option. You can, if you want, stand still and shoot things, or you can move. You'll probably have more than one place you can move to, and there's probably something influencing whether or not you want to be shooting at the time. In Smash TV, when you pick up a weapon power-up, they come with limited ammunition. They're not on a timer, they just run out when you've used them all up. This influences whether or not you want to be using them literally the entire time. You could, if you want, just go nuts with it, and this is where a lot of beginning players will start, just taking their upgraded power-up and shooting in the general direction of the swarms of bad things coming their way until it's gone. You could do that, but eventually you'll learn that each weapon has a better use case. The rocket launcher, for example, cuts through swarms of enemies, so it's better to line up as many as you can before you fire it. But that's an option you have to choose, since you'll need to use your movement abilities, which we mentioned earlier, to manipulate the enemies into the best possible arrangement to fire at them. In fact, the pickups spawning themselves are an example of options, because they're time limited. They don't stick around for very long, so when they appear, you have to make the decision of whether or not trying to get to it is even worth it. This will take a risk assessment of how much is between you and the power-up, and whether you can pull it off safely or whether chasing it is likely to get you killed. You do this in a split second, and it happens over and over and over and over, and it forms the basis for the second equally important design consideration. Not, as you might have thought, just shooting. The ability to actually shoot is just a tool, but it forms part of your broader moment-to-moment decision making, and a good twin-stick shooter will have enough mechanics or considerations in place to constantly present you with a multitude of options. I suppose if we were going to rename the genre more appropriately, it'd be twin-stick decision maker, but that doesn't sound as exciting, does it? As we go forward with this series and Project NBT grows in scope and features, I'll be pointing out to you all the ways in which we're sticking to either movement or options as design considerations, so that you get to see them in action. But for now, I want to set you some homework. Go and find a copy of Smash TV. I don't care where, it's available for free if you know where to look. Play it for a bit and see if you can see what I've just taught you. Notice every second how much you're being asked to consider, and how your mastery of the movement mechanics lets you make informed choices from beat to beat. And then come back and leave a comment saying, "Oh my gosh Zane, you know so many things, what a wonderfully brilliant golden god you are." I mean, in trying to find Smash TV, please don't do anything legally dubious. I would certainly never recommend anyone doing anything that might land them in legal trouble. On a completely unrelated topic, look at all these Zelda sprites I've borrowed. And on that bombshell, it is time to end. Please like this video if you liked it, and then subscribe for more videos like the one you liked since you liked it. And join me the next time I'm thinking, hey, let's talk game design.